thank you, especially for having me back. So today I will talk about the security patches that Apple did in iOS 6, 7, and 8. And we will see that's a study in fail. So yeah, I'm Stefan, blah, blah, blah. So when you talk about Apple and security, there's basically a lot to talk about, especially a lot to talk about fail. Apple is rich on fail. But this talk is, for example, not about Apple releasing an update, 8.01, that would then kill the cellular service on all the new devices. It's also not about the fact that Apple basically in 2014 or so, when everybody has learned that double linked lists are dangerous, they added unprotected double linked lists to the kernel heap in iOS 7. So they made exploitation of kernel heap overflows trivial. It's also not about them basically improving the iOS 7 early random number generator, so that then last year Taiji Jailbreak would completely rip it apart and calculate all future and past random numbers. And it's also not about this famous go-to-fail where they added a double go-to-fail in the SSL for iOS 6 to iOS 7 that basically completely broke SSL. So this is not what the talk is about, but there's a lot more to see when it comes to fail. So this talk is basically about the iOS jailbreaks and Apple fixing the bugs within. When it comes to fixing bugs, then there's this famous Yoda quote, you do it or you don't, but don't try. And the problem with that is he didn't account for the fact that the Apple security team are not Jedis. So Apple always tries and fails. So really this talk is about Apple trying to fix vulnerability, but not really doing it. So before I start, what are the ingredients of a jailbreak nowadays? You always have two major ingredients. One is the initial injection vector, and the second one is the persistency on the device. In jailbreak terms, this is usually called the untether. So I'm also not talking about these initial injection vectors, but apparently when you look at the updates that Apple issued, they also had several problems with fixing those bugs correctly, but we ignore that for now. I'm concentrating on this jailbreak persistency because that's where the most hilarious fails are. And why concentrate on persistency? When you look at the general injection vectors, you will see that the attack surface is gigantic, huge. So there's really no chance of Apple ever winning this thing. Just think about WebKit. So in iOS, usually you have the attack vectors USB, all the lockdown daemons. You have mobile Safari, and you have the malicious app thing. So of course, if you are inside a malicious app or inside mobile Safari, then many of the jailbreak vulnerabilities would not be enough. So you would require more powerful kernel bugs. But these for sure exist. They just don't get shared with Apple. They get sold in the underground. So, but when you now look at the persistency game, you will see that the attack surface is a lot smaller. This is something that Apple can kinda win. And Apple could make the attack surface smaller and smaller and smaller with every new release if they would only do it right. And the other problem with all these persistency things is consider local bugs by Apple, so they don't put any kind of priority on them. What they forget is that these public persistence exploit can be easily reused by any malicious attacker. So any attacker can take the untether package and then combine a different injection vector and then reuse it and basically don't waste bugs and do the whole attack a lot cheaper. Actually, it has been shown many times that companies like Finfisher completely their whole iOS surveillance package completely rely on the presence of public jailbreaks. So they make heavy use of that. So Apple not fixing those is really a security threat for everyone. Okay, let's start. We have to start with the so-called AMFI trickery. So this whole story starts with iOS 6 and the iOS 6 jailbreak. So basically the idea is that the evaders came up with this nice exploitation chain where they exploit the fact that the kernel asks the AMFI driver for the verification of signatures. Then the AMFI driver, in most cases, will ask the user space daemon for the verification. And the user space daemon will make use of libmis.dilib to actually verify something. And their idea is to just inject a malicious library into this AMFID that makes this libmis.dilib, just let's call it return true. So it's not as easy as it sounds, because they need several tricks to do that. First, they need a trick to make the dynamic linker actually open an injection in this library. And the second problem is, even if you succeed in the first step, you also need to trick the dynamic linker again to make it accept a not signed library. So the first thing that the evaders did, they just created a launch daemon configuration where they can set environment variables, and then they were just using this duld insert libraries environment variable to inject the library. And then they were using one of the many incomplete code signing bypasses for the second part. We will come to that later. So if you put the whole chain together, this is basically what the evasion jailbreak did. They trick AMFI by injecting this malicious library. This library will then re-export certain libmis.dilib functions to make them return true. And they would also then use the launchd config to, after AMFID has been tricked, to just start an arbitrary exploit binary that is not signed on the file system. And this binary then contains the kernel exploits. So they use an information leak, they use a memory corruption, and in the end they have a win. So Apple then tried to fix this, and they were actually quite aggressive to fix it. So the first thing they did was they killed the possibility to have a launchd config, or conf. Then they added a restrict section to the AMFID daemon, which makes the dynamic linker ignore injected libraries. Then they were fixing that incomplete code signing bypass, but it's in orange here because they didn't really fix it. And then they also fixed the kernel bugs that they used. So they were very aggressive and killed a lot of bugs in this chain. So the evaders needed new tricks. So they had now the problem that this incomplete code signing was patched. I call this patient alpha because it's the most hilarious fail of them all. And so evaders did not realize that this was an incomplete fix, so they unnecessarily burned another vulnerability that someone gave to them, and actually that someone, it's not me, he was not happy of them killing that bug. Then the other thing was to get around the fact that you cannot inject something into AMFID anymore. They just used this duld feature called enable dilibs to override cache. It's basically a flag file that you put on the file system, and then the dynamic linker will load libraries on the file system instead of relying on the secure cached version in the big cache. The next problem they had was because they removed this launchd.conf, they could not inject like an arbitrary launch daemon anymore. So what they did is they used the same vulnerabilities again, the injection of an arbitrary library and the code signing to get this library loaded in the first place. And they basically overwrote the xpcd_cache.dilib. This is how Apple implemented launch daemon code signing in iOS 6.1. So basically that file is a library, so it's code signed. And inside this library is basically just a big blob of data that has all the launch daemons data in it. And then instead of loading the launch daemons from disk, they load it from this library directly. And because you can just inject an arbitrary library and bypass code signing, they could just put in any launch daemons they wanted. And then again, they could just trigger execution of another binary after AMFID was triggered. They also exchanged the kernel vulnerabilities, so the new chain looked like this. You see at the heart of this, they have this enable dilibs to override cache file, and then the rest did not actually change a lot. Remember these pictures, you will see it again and again. So, of course, Apple now fixed at some point evasion 7, and they did it in a less aggressive way. So they basically killed the kernel bugs, and they killed this new trick to make DILT accept an unsigned binary, an unsigned library. So they did not aggressively kill all the other parts of the chain. This was a big mistake, because at that point, the guys of Pangu realized that Apple did not actually fix patient alpha, and so they were just using the old bug again. They were using a problem in the patch, and then they were just putting new kernel bugs together, and the whole chain is still the same. So the whole logic of the Pangu jailbreak is basically borrowed from the evaders. So Apple now tried to fix that. Déjà vu, they did the same thing again. They killed the kernel bugs, at least they thought so, and they killed the incomplete code signing bug, the patient alpha, at least they thought so. So the rest of the chain they left completely untouched, so that it could be reused by the next jailbreakers. In this case, the Pangu guys were again the next jailbreakers, and apparently they realized that patient alpha was not correctly fixed again, so they just changed their exploit a little bit, and they could bypass the code signing again. For the kernel bugs, I'm not 100% sure, because Pangu is basically heavily obfuscating their jailbreak so that you cannot look inside. So it is said that basically the bug they're using for the Pangu 8 is the incorrectly patched one for the iOS 7. Again, this is exactly the same thing the evaders did, the same exploitation chain. And again, Apple tried to fix this, and again, they did not fix the whole chain. They only fixed the actual patient alpha, and they fixed the kernel bugs. This time, maybe for real or so. Then, at some point in time, it was time for the Taiji Jailbreak. Remember this, it's the same thing over again. They exploited patient alpha because Apple had fixed it wrongly again, and they used new kernel bugs, and it's always the same. They don't fix the actual full chain, they only fix the things that then are fixed incorrectly, and the people can just rearrange their jailbreaks a little bit and everything is fine again. Actually, it's not completely true. There's a few other things under the hood, but in the end, they are not really that problematic for the attacker. So at this point, you might have realized that the iOS 7, 8, and all the intermediate jailbreaks, they all relied on the fact that there is this enable dilibs to override cache in the middle of this chain. So I already said that this is basically this file in system library caches com apple dilt. And when it's present on the disk, it will then start loading these libraries from file instead of the cached copy. And the whole exploitation chains for all these 7, 8, and 7.1 and 8.1 jailbreaks, they all rely on this same thing to first get a malicious libmiss into the AMFID, and then to replace the list of launch daemons via the other XPCD cached dilib. So everybody should be seeing this on the very first view, that this is the heart of these jailbreaks, and this is something that needs to be killed, otherwise they will abuse it over and over and over again. So for me personally, just drawing this, it's very obvious what to kill, but Apple apparently has other goals, so they did not kill it. Also, I don't see why this file should ever be allowed in the file system in the first place, because there is nothing on a real iPhone that would allow you to use it in any way. So it's a feature that is completely useless on an iPhone, except maybe for Apple, who are having some development stuff they can boot, but we don't know because this is all unknown and secret by Apple. Anyway, for real iPhone, it makes no sense that this feature is in the dynamic linker. It only makes jailbreaks possible. So remember, this was first used in the iOS 7 jailbreak in December 2013, and now it's 2015 March, and it's 14 months already that it was used in the public, and it's still not fixed. And from a strategic standpoint, just looking at this change, this is the heart of all this change. Just ripping it out would totally kill the techniques that Pangu and Taiji were using. So instead, what Apple did was they created security by obscurity patches to make the root file system no longer writable. So people were just searching through drivers, were reversing a bit, find the places to patch, and then these protections were gone, so they didn't actually gain a lot, just a few hours of reversing to basically get around it. And the other thing is they created this team identifier hack that basically stops you from injecting libraries of other people into like system processes or into other applications. But you can just download the slides from Pangu that they released yesterday, and you see that it is so easy to bypass that it did not really cause big troubles for them. Okay, let's get to patient alpha, the incomplete code signing bug. So what is incomplete code signing? First of all, you need to know that normally everything that is loaded from disk in executables needs to be code signed. But that's not really true. The simplified explanation is that if a segment is not executable and there's no signature, then there will be no check, basically. So missing signature is not a problem, normally. So this changes if this page is actually executable. The moment it has the executable bit, any access to that page will require code signature. That includes a pure read access. So if you try to read from a code signed from a executable page, it will error out because there's no code signature. So prior to iOS 5, the major way to do anteceding exploits was therefore to have an all data dilib injected into a process, and this all data dilib would then use the DULD metadata structures inside the file to actually exploit the DULD itself. So for example, they would use mod init functions, would point them to gadget instead of like real functions. They would use interposing to override functions so they call other function instead, and so on and so on. There's a lot of tricks they used in the pre-iOS 5 days. So around the end of iOS 4, like one of the very last versions, Apple basically added checks to the dynamic linker to enforce that the load comments, which are these things that basically control how the header is, no, how the file is basically loaded into memory, where the execution starts, what libraries are loaded, and so on. All this is stored in the load comments. So since the end of iOS 4, Apple enforced that this is inside an executable segment. That means that when they parse the headers and have passed this check, they can theoretically be secure that they just accessed something that needs to be executable, so the code signature should be there. So it should be a valid code signature. Oh, by the way, when Macports file is loaded from disk, it loads all these segments defined in the load comments, and for every segment there is a virtual address and a virtual size, and a file position and a file size. And you see they just take the segments and pull them into memory, basically, with the memory mapped, with the mmap system call. So let's get back. The idea is that when something is loaded, there should be this check that enforces it's a code-signed page, and so the header should not be changed. But this is not really true, because it's not that simple. The thing is that when this dynamic library is loaded, the header is loaded into the stack, and then first of all, it starts working on that header inside the stack memory. So that stack memory is, of course, not executable, so there's no check. Then what happens next is they call a function called sniff load comments, and this function is used to verify or basically to gather information about the file, like count how many libraries are there, how many segments or so. So at some point in 4.3 something, Apple introduced security checks in there. And this is a place where they validate that it's a readable, executable segment. The next thing is then that the code will load a code signature if one is inside the file. And then it will start mapping the segments into memory as the header specifies it. Then, since like at least iOS 5, they call a function that's called crash if invalid code signature. So the idea is of this function, they just touch every segment once with a read, and if that was an executable segment, it needs to have a code signature, otherwise it would crash. And the last step here is that they initiate this finish, and there they start basically parsing the header again and again. And in the first pass, they basically adjust the pointer that is used for accessing the header to be into the actual allocated paged memory. So this is actually the first time that header parsing actually makes use of the previously loaded segments. So this is the first time where a malicious header would actually be accessed and causing a problem by the parser. Of course, because of the crash if code signing would happen before, but the parser will the first time actually hit that memory in that final function. So this is obviously a big problem if you see through it, because it's a time of check, time of use vulnerability. The check is very much in the beginning, and the use is very late later, and what happens in between can exploit this. And in this case, it's the actual memory mapped that can exploit it. So we just have to trick the map segments to ensure that we don't trigger the code signature. So the evaders came up with this trick where they used the feature of mmaps, that if you mmap the same address twice, the older mapping will just be silently discarded. So what they do is they just put two segments into the file. The first one is the real one that contains the load comments and is readable, executable. So it will pass all the checks in sniff load comment. And the second one is just a copy of the fake load comments. And the second one is readable, writable. So what happens is it will just kill the old mapping that is readable, executable, and replace it with a new one and that is readable, writable, and because it's not executable, when the code later touches this memory, it will not require a code signature. That's the whole idea behind the evasion 6 trick. So then Apple started fixing it. It's the first fix. So what they did is they added the detection for overlapping segments. So they basically tested if the load comment segment overlaps with any other segment, and they do this by checking the virtual addresses and virtual sizes of these segments. There's one big problem with this fix that was known for a long time, and that is that if you, for example, put the load comment segment to the very end of the address space in the configuration in the header and let it wrap into the beginning of the address space, then the whole check of the overlap would not work because of integer overlaps. So in reality, it would not map it like this, because in reality, it would add the ASLR slides to this minus 4 kilobyte page. So in reality, it would actually be somewhere in memory mapped. But what you can see here, these segments basically overlap a bit, and they are not, going detected by the check. So that's when Apple basically created the second fix. So they try to detect when this happens to the load comment segment. And so now when you have this kind of setup, it will be detected and it will error out. Second fix, second release. There's a problem with this. They totally forgot that the other segments could also overlap. So if you just turn around the tables and just make the other segment overlap, then they did not detect that with their fix. So what was Apple thinking? So the third fix obviously now supported that all were checked for overlaps, integer overlaps, and now all this gets detected. So that was the third fix, the third release. But really, actually, Apple security and the jailbreakers were fighting over nothing, because the security check was broken from the very beginning. The whole check was wrong, because when you call map segments, it actually uses the file size for loading a segment, and the checks were on the virtual size, the VM size. So Apple was checking the wrong variable the whole time. So if you just had two segments where the virtual address and virtual size and the load comments virtual size and so on, if they don't map at all, you just make the other segment a very large file size, and then the map segments would just create this very large segment and destroy the header memory and overwrite it with the mapping. So the whole time they were fighting over fixes for fixes for fixes that never even touch the real bug. So now that's where Apple's fourth fix for the same vulnerability comes into play. They basically check now that the file size is not bigger than the virtual size. And if that happens, it's forbidden. The other thing is they added a bunch of other checks now to sniff load comments, which accidentally kills another way to bypass this whole thing. It has nothing to do with overlaps. I will disclose that when I write it down in my blog later this month or so, the next month. So in total, it only took Apple about 2 years to realize they were fixing the wrong bug. And I'm absolutely not disclosing, absolutely not claiming at this moment that it's over. So I'm not saying this is not bypassable anymore, but this is all I say about this. So the next thing was the kernel vulnerabilities that the guys were using for the exploits. The first one was Macport K-object. That is a debugging Mach API call. And the purpose of this call is to give you back the K-object field associated with a Mach port in memory. So now Mach ports can be of different types. And depending on that type, the K-object pointer contains different things. For example, for IOKit objects, which you learned about yesterday, they contain the address of the object in memory. So you could directly ask for the address of the object in memory. You would get basically the address of a vtable pointer for free. The next thing is there are so-called host ports. And if you ask host ports for with this function here, you will get the address of the host port argument for K-object. And that is basically the variable real host that is in the kernel data segment. If you have other ports, then K-object will be filled by completely different things depending on that port type. So the security problem here is that you can leak these addresses and they are easy for exploitation. So this was the situation before iOS 6. So Apple fixed that for iOS 6. To fix number 1, they added address obfuscation all over the place, usually used by the VM kernel address perm macro. And this is working by having a random number, 32 or 64-bit, that is just added to the kernel address. And because you don't know the secret, unless you're Taiji and can compute them, then you can basically not guess what the address in kernel was, because it's just basically obfuscated for you. The idea is to stop the leakage of kernel pointers. So this whole add obfuscation has one big problem. If you add a secret to an address, and you have once the plain address and the obfuscated address, then the secret is just the one minus the other. And the other problem is, because the same secret is used for all pointers, just breaking this once destroys the whole obfuscation. So now we have a big problem. Remember this? For host ports, this function returns the address of the real host variable in kernel obfuscated. But this is a data segment of the kernel. It has a fixed address for one kernel, so you know the address if you have got access to the kernel binary at least once. So this completely breaks the whole obfuscation. So Apple fixed that, fix number 2. So now they basically detect in that function if something is actually a kernel address, then they just remove the KSLR slide. If it's not a kernel address, they just permutate it to obfuscate it again. This stops the attack to host ports. And that's basically what they did in iOS 8, which is 3 months after it was used by Pangu. But Pangu used it in a different way, we will see soon. So we still have a problem, because remember, other ports have something else in there. And there's this one master port, the master of the master, basically, and he gets initialized the K object with the value 1. So now you can break this obfuscation by just subtracting 1 from the obfuscated master port address. Yeah, fun fact, this bug was taught by me in various trainings for a while, until the Pangu guys used it in their jailbreak in June last year. This means it was publicly used 3 months before iOS 8, and then it was reused by Taiji in November, and Apple never fixed it. And at this point, I should have already known that their fix 2 was basically insufficient, because the Pangu jailbreak could already bypass their fix 2. But Apple released anyway, so 3 months later, they got the update. Now the last part was fixed again, now in iOS 8.1.3, and they fixed it the Apple way, so they just removed the function. So removing the function spares you the embarrassment to fix something wrong. And this time they only required 7 months to fix it from public use until they actually fixed it. And the other nice thing is they created this vulnerability to Pangu, to Taig. Also, it was actually Pangu who used it 7 months before, and Pangu also learned it from me. So crediting Taig is definitely the wrong thing. Okay, let's get to the next thing, kext request. This is another famous vulnerability. It's a Mach API call, and it allows applications to basically gather information about the loaded kernel extensions. And in theory, you could also do some other stuff, but this is all locked down on iOS. And the nice thing about this function is it works within the sandbox. So originally, it would return some pointers. So Apple, before they added KSLR to the kernel, they were unsliding these load addresses, so that there would be no KSLR leak the moment that iOS 6 was released with KSLR. So we are interested in this call here, the get loaded kext info, and that basically returns a big, big serialized dictionary of all the information about all the kernel extension plus the kernel itself. And this information contains basically the Mach-O headers of these files, but Apple even went so far to pass these headers to unslide the virtual addresses before they give it back to you so that you cannot break KSLR. So this is how you would use this function. And what you get back looks a lot like this. So you have a big blob that contains a lot of stuff. And for every kernel extension, for every, including the kernel, you basically get a base64 encoded blob of the Mach-O header. Now if you take that, open it up, decode the base64, you can dump the Mach-O header and can look into it. So that's what Mark Dowd did in 2012, October. And so he did a talk about iOS 6.0, the very first release. So during his talk, he basically disclosed that Apple forgot to patch some of the pointers because there is not only segments in the file, there are also sections defined in the file, and these section addresses were not unslid. So at this point in 2012, basically everybody was auditing this function and learning about this vulnerability and looking how they patched the bug. So this function got a lot of attention by a lot of people. And if you look in this function, you will see at some time that there's additional bugs in this function. And the problem here in particular was that they would unslide. Well, they would unslide only if it's in the main kernel, the address, or if it's in the pre-linked kernel extension. But in the kernel cage binary that you would have and that you would get information about, there would be actually segments in between those, and they would never be unslid because this macro here would not consider them unslide worthy. So they did not unslide it, so you could just call this function, go to, for example, the pre-linked info segment, get the address, and then you have broken KSLR. So, fun fact, that was used by Pangu also in June, and later used in November by Taiji again. And Apple released 8.1.3, and they fixed it the Apple way for iOS. They removed the OS bundle Mach-O headers key from the return value of kex request. So if they would fuck something up, they would not be embarrassed again. But they actually lie about this in the announcement, because in the announcement they say they have fixed it. But in reality, by unsliding, but in reality they just removed this. Again, this only took them like 2 years to realize that there was a second bug in that function, and 7 months after it was used. And this is usually a demonstration bug in my training, so usually I tell people, oh, this was a doubt bug, and let's please look at the output on a recent iOS, and then they see within 10 minutes that there's something wrong. So I don't know why it takes Apple security to have like 2 years. Okay, there's one more thing. Most of these bugs apply to OS X as well. So it's basically absolutely no surprise that Apple fixed this with the release of OS X.10.10.2. The difference is they are not stripping these headers out, so they actually try to fix it. And at this point, you should not be surprised that they fucked it up again. Because what they do here is they have this macro, maybe they even changed it, but it's the same problem, where they have the smaller instead of the smaller equal. So what this means is that the VM kernel top is defined as the last kernel symbol. So basically, the last kernel symbol will not be unslid if you have a pointer to it. So the compiler and the linker put the last kernel signal into a segment by itself, into the last segment, into the last section. So because that is obviously not smaller because it's equal, it's not unslid. So this means you just call kex request on the latest OS X and go to the last segment, and then you have broken KSLR again. Okay, that's for the bugs. Now come to the other interesting topic, jailbreak made in China. And you will have realized that in the last year there were several jailbreaks, and they were this time not made by the usual suspects. They were basically done by Chinese teams. And the jailbreak community is actually completely crazy about these teams, because these teams managed to break several iOS versions in very short time, and they were just giving it to them, and not like the Westerners, which just like dangle it in front of them and tell them we have broken it, but we release it when the next version, when the next major version comes out. So that's the thing, the Chinese always deliver, but why? So for the Western jailbreakers, I would say they are very open of what they were doing. Of course, they wouldn't release directly the source code of the latest jailbreak, but they would always release snippets of source code. They make it publicly available. A lot of those actually have licenses that would not allow you to basically use it in your own stuff, but they just made it available so you can learn from it. The next problem is, now with the new laws for export control, it will be hard or impossible to have an international cooperation to generate a jailbreak, because they are always exporting exploits all the time over the borders. Like, for example, the evaders were Americans, French people, and Germans. So it's several times over the border. So it's really export of exploits the whole time. The other thing is they were asking for donations. And basically, yeah, they got a little bit. They even tried to improve that. But in the end, it was not that much compared to a job in InfoSec. They always claim they got like top 100K US dollar. Considering how many millions use these jailbreaks, is a very small number. The other thing what they realized all the time is that basically every single security company offering iOS work uses their jailbreaks, and not a single one of those would make their money if they would not release the jailbreak. And they were basically giving it for them to free, and they had nothing out of it. And the last thing is, if you just deal with the greedy jailbreak community a while, just try hanging out with them, you will realize that they actually don't care about your work. They just want it for free and as fast as possible. And if you dare to speak up, they will like they will basically start shitstorms. This happened to me all the time, but because I'm giving them stuff back all the time. But it basically happens to every single jailbreaker in history. The moment they are not releasing jailbreaks fast enough, they get like a lot of shitstorm, and so after a while you just have no interest in doing this anymore. So for the Chinese, it's completely different. Their motivation is money. They get a lot of money from the Chinese app stores that they bundle, and they actually use this money to buy new vulnerabilities and exploits from even Westerners, just to be able to get the next jailbreak out and to basically release the next one and get more money. An example for this is, for example, for iOS 8, they offered 100 to 300,000 US dollar for people that would give them a way to write to the file system. The other thing is they use very questionable methods in their jailbreaks that the Westerners would never touch. Like the very first Pangu would have a stolen Chinese enterprise certificate in it, and the initial injection vector was basically relying on having a stolen enterprise certificate. The other thing is they took all the code they could get from all the other Westerner jailbreakers, ignoring whatever license these things had, and they just incorporated in the jailbreak and release it at their work. But if you actually disassemble it, you will find a lot of public and also non-public stuff they took from my training, and you will see they used basically all that code and did very little work to do actually themselves. The other thing is they had a lot of luck concerning Apple's lack of security quality assurance. They have basically relied on the techniques invented by evaders and marked out and so on. And because Apple security was fixing this stuff wrong and wrong and wrong again, they could basically use the same vulnerabilities over and over again. So the jailbreaks were actually very easy for them. So that's why they are able to deliver the jailbreak so fast. The next thing, which is even worse for the community, is that unlike the Westerners, the Chinese are completely closed. They are not releasing any code that would help the other iOS research community. They do the opposite. They actually use, meanwhile, commercial-grade enterprise obfuscation tools on their jailbreaks so that people cannot look inside, whatever they want to hide. The other thing is they create kernel patches, at least the Pangu guys, that are incomplete by choice. So all this stuff that normally researchers require, they just don't put into their jailbreaks. So they also destroy basically part of the header inside the kernel, so that a lot of tools that the jailbreak research people have will just fail on Pangu Jailbreak just because they don't want any competition, they just want the money for themselves. Okay, so the conclusion here is, in my point of view, it's very obvious from all these fails that Apple does not test their security fixes, not at all. And their failure basically made all the Chinese jailbreaks possible. And one big problem here is, I guess, that Apple gets celebrated for jailbreaks. When you see the media articles, they will say, oh, great, there's a new jailbreak. But they will never get taken seriously, like this is actually exploits for vulnerabilities that can hurt people. And the other thing is, in my eyes, media should actually stress the fact that these jailbreaks are actually used by people like Finn Fisher to own other people. And yeah, that's basically it.
Well done. Round of applause for Stefan. Yes, as always, he delivers a good talk. I'm assuming there'll be questions, right? Questions?
Yeah,
anyone?
Are there any questions? Please don't ask about Pangu.
But you are the teacher.
Hi.
Yes.
I asked a friend, because Pangu team is my friend, and he asked me to ask a question that, do you have any evidence that Pangu has paid by Chinese company with $1 million US? Do you have any evidence?
Well, the thing is, they even claim it to other reporters that they got a lot of money. I know that some reporter is actually trying to get a story about this, and they interviewed Pangu, and they say to themselves that they got 1 million or around 1 million. So the other thing is that there were other Chinese companies that actually were basically approaching all the Western jailbreakers 2 years ago, and they were sending emails where they said, oh yeah, you can get up to 1 million, blah, blah, blah. And the next thing is that Xu Hao from Pangu basically said himself that I get a shit ton of money from it. And if he's now asking if I have evidence, it's like yeah, I don't have evidence because it was said in confidence in a hotel room between him and me. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
That's a good one. Anyone else?
What? Never ever.
Yay. He has moral standing. Anyone else? No? You can talk to him in private and record his conversation. That's evidence.
I should do that in the future, yes.
Exactly, exactly. All right, if not, once again, thank you, Stefan. Thank you.